A few years ago, I came up with the proposed diagnosis of covert borderline. The covert borderline is a hybrid of narcissistic and borderline traits and behaviors and affects and cognitions. Narcissistic and borderline dynamics, or as Kernberg would put it, a borderline personality organization coupled with a narcissistic disorder or narcissistic character disorder. If you conflate the two, if you put them together, there's a confluence, there's a synergy between them, and it gives rise to the covert borderline. You may ask, what was the need for a new diagnosis? Aren't there enough, proliferating as they are? Well, there is a void, there is a lacuna, there is a missing link between pathological narcissism and borderline. And I think the covert borderline is the bridge between these two. Those of you who are interested in learning more about covert borderline, please visit the covert borderline playlist, which includes umpteen videos about this proposed diagnosis. But today we're going to discuss something completely different. When, under which circumstances, does the covert borderline become a narcissist? And under which circumstances does the covert borderline becomes a borderline? What happens externally and internally to drive the covert borderline to shed one dimension, one aspect of his or her personality and become a so-called pure type? Again, covert borderline is a hybrid. What happens when we take away one of the two elements? When we take away the narcissism, what's left is a borderline. Take away the borderline, what's left is a narcissist. But when does this happen spontaneously, in the wild, so to speak? Since coming up with the idea of the covert, or the diagnosis, proposed diagnosis of the covert borderline, I've had a lot of time to observe covert borderlines. As I said, in the wild, I've corresponded with many people. Many people said that the diagnosis of covert borderline resonates with them after decades of trying to understand themselves. They were misdiagnosed as narcissists. They were misdiagnosed as borderline. They were misdiagnosed as bipolar, you name it, autism. And finally, they came home. Finally, they found a diagnosis that covered all their symptoms, all their traits, all their behaviors, and the internal psychological processes and dynamics that they have been experiencing lifelong. So it seems to me, although I'm a bit biased, but it seems to me that covert borderline should take its place among other diagnoses in due time. In psychology, it's a very long process. Okay, before we go into the topic of today's video, I would like to make a few announcements. I'm going to be in Vienna the second week of September. If you would like to book a paid consultation with me, face-to-face, write to me. My email address is in the description of the video, and the description of the video is under the video, shockingly. Another thing, I'm going to be in Paris soon, so if you would like to organize something in Paris, lecture, seminar, it's free of charge. I do not charge a speaker's fee. If you would like to book a face-to-face consultation with me in Paris, again, my email address in the description under the video, write to me. Another announcement, we have now a website of transcripts, full-length, full-fledged transcripts of all my videos. We have another website dedicated to summaries, text summaries of all my videos. And so you can get the gist of my videos without having to endure the bad audio, my thick accent, and hours of verbosity. And finally, there's a YouTube channel. It's called Malignant Narcissism Summaries. This YouTube channel is not affiliated with me. It's not my channel. But on this channel, the owners of the channel are posting clips and shorts, which again capture the essence of my videos, my message, my concepts, and so on and so forth. So there's a transcripts website, text summaries website, and a video summaries website. YouTube channel, and you can find the links to all three in the description. Yes, the description is getting cluttered. I fully concur. And now, before we proceed to discuss the deconstruction of the borderline, of the covert borderline, the devolution of the covert borderline into a narcissistic state or a borderline state, before we go there, I would like to clarify the concepts of comorbidity and type constancy, concepts which emerge from the flawed methodology of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. You've all heard the term comorbidity. Comorbidity is when the same patient is diagnosed with two or more mental health issues. So if, for example, you're diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder and at the same time with borderline personality disorder, you have a comorbidity. If you're diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder and at the same time with a mood disorder, for example, depression, you have a dual diagnosis or a co-occurrence, which is also considered to be a comorbidity. But actually, there's no such thing as comorbidity. There's no such thing as comorbidity because it is an artifact of the flawed system of diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The DSM uses a categorical system to diagnose people, and this categorical system is counterfactual, does not reflect reality, clinical reality, and yields comorbidities. Similarly, there's no such thing as a pure mental illness or a pure personality disorder or a pure mental health issue. No such thing. There's no type constant categories. Take, for example, overt narcissism versus covert narcissism. Many people, especially self-styled experts online, would tell you that there are two types of narcissists. The overt ones, also mistakenly called the grandiose ones, and the covert ones, also mistakenly called the vulnerable ones. Why mistakenly? Because all narcissists are both grandiose and vulnerable. And all narcissists go through phases of covert narcissism and phases of overt narcissism. All, you heard me right. There are no different types. It's just different phases in the lifespan or life cycle of the narcissist. So let's summarize. There's no such thing as comorbidities or co-occurrences. There's no such thing as pure type constant categorical disorders. These are mere artifacts of the flawed Diagnostic and Statistical Manual system. Clinicians who use the International Classification of Diseases don't come up with comorbidities or co-occurrences or pure types. If you want to learn how people are diagnosed under the International Classification of Diseases, watch the two videos. There are links in the description. Click on these links and enlighten yourself as to how the ICD is used. My name is Sam Vaknin, and I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and a professor of psychology. Covert borderlines belong in the cluster B personality disorders. Again, to remind you, it's a proposed diagnosis. It's not mainstream. It's not been accepted widely yet. And so, like every other cluster B personality disorder, covert borderlines are subject to collapse dynamics. Collapse simply means that the person or the patient or the client with cluster B personality disorder is unable to regulate internally because of lacking, deficient, interrupted, or wrong feedback from the environment, mainly from other people. So, for example, when the psychopath fails, when the psychopath is unable to secure his or her goals, when the psychopath fails to accomplish a target, then the psychopath experiences collapse. Similarly, in classic pathological narcissism, when the narcissist fails to obtain narcissistic supply, attention, fails to maintain appearances, fails to buttress, uphold, and support his or her grandiosity, fails to somehow preserve the inflated, fantastic, unrealistic, counterfactual self-concept, when this happens because of an interruption in the flow of narcissistic supply, or lack of availability of high-quality narcissistic supply, or isolation for some reason, or whatever, in this case, the narcissist experiences a state of collapse. What would be a collapse in covert borderline? How would the covert borderline collapse? Or more precisely, why would the covert borderline collapse? Well, there are two reasons basically. And they both involve substantive failures. Now pay attention to the difference. Pathological narcissists, they endure and experience collapse when they fail to maintain appearances, when they fail to communicate their fantasy, their inflated grandiose self-concept to other people and elicit and solicit from them narcissistic supply. So narcissists are not concerned about substance. They're not concerned about what's real. They have a very complicated relationship with the truth. Narcissists are focused on convincing other people that their false self is not false, that their fantasy is real, that their self-concept as brilliant, geniuses, omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful, amazing, drop-dead gorgeous, handsome, perfection reified. They want to convince other people that these are true assertions. That is all true. And so the narcissist is focused on impression management, on communication. The narcissist couldn't care less if any of this is true because the narcissist is delusional. The first person the narcissist deceives in the long parade, in this long voyage, the first person who falls prey to the narcissist's fantastic delusionality is the narcissist himself. He convinces himself that he is truly godlike, he is truly a perfect entity or being, and then he sets out to convert other people to this point of view, to communicate this self-concept as if it were 100% factual, grounded in reality, and absolutely correct. So when this fails, when this enterprise of impression management fails, the narcissist experiences collapse. In covert borderline, the collapse is completely different. It also involves failure, but it involves real substantive failure, not a failure of fantasy, not a failure of a narrative, not a failure of a movie or a piece of fiction, but a real failure. A real failure, for example, of an interpersonal relationship, a real failure of intimacy or a romantic liaison, a real failure at the workplace, in a career. So when the narcissist fails to convince other people how great he is, the narcissist experiences collapse. When the covert borderline fails truly and really in something he or she attempts to do, maintain a relationship, succeed at work, get promoted, make money, you name it, then the covert borderline experiences collapse. We could say that the locus of the collapse of the narcissist is in the fantasy. It's a failure of the fantasy. Whereas the locus of collapse of the covert borderline is in reality. It's a failure in reality. In this sense, ironically, the covert borderline is much closer to the psychopath than to the narcissist. Psychopaths are goal-oriented, and when they fail to obtain goals, they endure or experience a collapse. We'll not discuss this today. Okay, so we distinguish between two types of collapse in covert borderline. The collapse, a career-related collapse, a collapse in the workplace, failing to get promoted, failing to get appreciated or recognized for some accomplishment, being sidelined, being bullied, you name it. A failure at work, failure at the job. Even if you're self-employed, a failure to obtain self-set goals. So this is one type of collapse, career-induced or career-related collapse. And the second type of collapse is the interpersonal collapse, when the covert borderline fails to maintain a relationship with another person that somehow conforms to or adheres to the intensity demanded by the covert borderline, the commitment, the investment. Remember that covert borderlines, as the name implies, are borderlines. They are terrified of abandonment and rejection. They have problems with introject constancy. They are addicted to object constancy, to the presence of the other person in their lives. They are heavily into intense, passionate, dramatic relationships. They have a love fantasy. They are love addicted. And this applies also to relationship with best friends. And so the second type of collapse in covert borderline is the interpersonal collapse. Now let's see what happens in each of these two types of collapse. In the career-induced collapse or the career-related collapse, the false self of the covert borderline emerges, takes over, kind of suppresses all the other aspects of the personality and substitutes for them, becomes the personality. Now, bear in mind that both narcissists and borderlines have a false self. The false self is a construct that is theorized or observed in both people with pathological narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, and people with borderline personality organization or borderline personality disorder. Both these types of people, patients, clients, they have a false self. The false self is therefore doubly amplified in the covert borderline, and yet it is latent in most cases. The false self in the covert borderline is more like an intellectual or intellectualized organizing principle or hermeneutic principle, explanatory principle. So the false self, the covert borderline uses the false self to make sense of his life, of reality, to set goals, purpose, and direction, and to self-aggrandize or self-enhance. And in this sense, the covert borderline is similar to the narcissist. But when there is a crisis, when there is a career-related collapse, the false self takes over, is rendered much more grandiose, delusionally grandiose. Cognitive distortions are enormous. The perception of reality is completely impaired. There's impaired reality testing. And this misapprehension of one's self-concept, this sudden belief that one is invincible, immune to the consequences of one's actions, endowed with impunity, that one is impermeable, untouchable, superior in every way, can do no wrong, gets everything right, always. This sudden onslaught of counterfactual delusional grandiosity floods the zone of the covert borderline, and he becomes completely detached from reality. And because the main message is, I am supreme, I am more intelligent than anyone, I'm all powerful, I am omniscient, I'm all-knowing, I'm perfect, I'm a genius, I'm amazing, I'm super handsome, and so on. This leads to antisocial or psychopathic behaviors, defiance, contumaciousness, rejection or conflict with authority, externalized aggression, mainly verbal, and recklessness. The covert borderline, having experienced a career-related collapse, becomes a malignant narcissist, a confluence of psychopathy and narcissism. It's not a dark personality, it's not a dark triad personality, because dark personalities are subclinical. Whereas in the case of the covert borderline, the transition to malignant narcissism is totally clinical. In other words, a covert borderline that would present in clinical settings to a clinician or diagnostician would be diagnosed as either a narcissist or a borderline or a comorbidity of narcissism and borderline. But a covert borderline who presents in a state of collapse would be diagnosed by the diagnostician as a malignant narcissist. Okay, what happens when the collapse is interpersonal? The disintegration of a relationship, a very acrimonious divorce, betrayal by one's best friend, cheating, infidelity of the partner, ruination and eradication of the love fantasy or the addiction to love. What happens when the covert borderline wakes up, is awakened or enlightened suddenly and realizes that it's all been a lie, it's all been fake, it's all been a fantasy? He feels betrayed, stabbed, backstabbed, he feels lonely, solipsistically lonely, existentially lonely. What happens then in this state of interpersonal collapse? The covert borderline becomes a classic borderline. The locus of control becomes external. The covert borderline is suddenly clinging, needy, codependent. At the same time, the covert borderline develops mood lability, ups and downs, dysregulated affects, dysregulated emotion. He is overwhelmed by all kinds of sensations and feelings which he cannot control, which drown him, which disable him. And the dysregulation is perceived as a kind of paralysis. The behaviors of the covert borderline in an interpersonal collapse become highly borderline, highly erratic, highly dramatic, passive-aggressive. Promiscuity and other types of recklessness take over. Drinking, substance use disorders, sadistic, punitive misconduct, splitting, where the covert borderline begins to see everyone as either enemy, friend or foe, all good, all bad, angelic or demonic. There's a lot of switching between identities, identity diffusion, which is highly reminiscent of some types of dissociative identity disorder. This is known as switching. And there's a lot of cycling between idealization and evaluation. Let's summarize. In the work-related, career-related, goal-related collapse, when the covert borderline fails to externally attain some goals, the covert borderline becomes a malignant narcissist. When the collapse has to do with an interpersonal relationship, the covert borderline becomes a classic borderline. In both states of collapse, there are common clinical features. For example, a high level of dissociation with compensatory confabulation. There's a lot of acting out, paranoid ideation, and attention seeking. I deal with each and every one of the things that I've said in this video in separate videos. So all you have to do is go through the relevant playlists or go to the search box and type in dissociation or confabulation or acting out, and you will find the video you're seeking. Similarly, as I said, there are playlists. For example, there's a playlist dedicated to trauma and dissociation. Work your way through the website, through the channel. There are well over 2,000 videos. But this, in a nutshell, is what happens to the covert borderline when reality intrudes harshly and does not accommodate the covert borderline's narcissistic grandiose aspects, coupled with the covert borderline's desperate need for the kind of fantastic love that exists only in Disney movies and not even there anymore.